Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to look at how we can add FIDO2-related mutations to a Hot Chocolate 13 GraphQL API. Now you'll notice that I have a pre-existing solution with an API project. Inside the API project, I have our data migrations, and I also have our application DB context, our application user entity, and our three FIDO2 related entities. I also have a previously created public key credential type, which models our public key credential entity in the GraphQL schema. Inside the app settings.development.json, I have our connection string for our default connection, and I also have our FIDO2 related app settings like so. I also have a query class which contains a get public key credentials method, which will expose a field in the schema to get the public key credentials from our database. Inside the program.c# file, I'm adding in our application DB context. I'm adding a distributed memory cache. For the purposes of this sample, we'll just be using a distributed memory cache implementation. However, for your application's requirements, you may wish to use an alternative or production-ready distributed cache implementation. We're then adding the FIDO2 services and configuring the options using those values from our app settings. We're adding a GraphQL server with our query type. We have two type converters to convert from a byte array to a string and vice versa. We're then registering the application DB context, and within the middleware, we're using static files, more on that later, and then we're mapping the GraphQL endpoint in order to allow users to go to /GraphQL to send GraphQL requests to the API. So the first thing that we are going to want to do is wire up the distributed memory cache and the FIDO2 service into our GraphQL server. So what we're going to do, where we have our call to add GraphQL server, just beneath the register DB context, I'm going to say register service, and the first one of these is going to be of type I distributed cache, like so. I'm then going to register another service of type I FIDO2, like so. And that will set up the distributed cache and the FIDO2 services within the GraphQL server to enable them to be used through dependency injection into our queries and mutations. Next up, we are going to want to add a handful of type converters in order to convert from the various FIDO2 enums to strings. So what I'm going to do is beneath our current type converters for byte array is I'm going to add several type converters for the FIDO2 enums. So the first one of these is going to be a type converter from authenticator attachment to string and vice versa. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say FIDO2 netlib dot objects dot authenticator attachment. I'm going to convert that to a string like so. And within the expression, I'm going to say source dot to enum member value. And that's going to convert the authenticator attachment enum to a string. I'm then going to add another type converter to do the same thing, but in reverse. So I'm going to say add type converter of type string, and a second type parameter will be FIDO2 netlib dot objects dot authenticator attachment, like so. And within the expression, I'm going to say source dot to enum, and then this is going to be our FIDO2 netlib dot objects dot authenticator attachment, like so. And this is going to handle the automatic conversion of the authenticator attachment enum to a string and vice versa. So that will allow us in our GraphQL schema to have the fields or properties or inputs typed as strings, whereas in our API itself, they can be typed as the enum. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy that like so, and we're going to create another converter for the authenticator transport. So for that, I'm going to say authenticator transport like so, and I'm going to add that in as a second set of type converters. We're then going to do the same thing again for public key credential type. So what we can do is we can replace authenticator transport with public key credential type, like so. Next up, we're going to want to do the same thing again, but for resident key requirement, like so. And then last but not least, we're going to want to add a type converter for the user verification requirement enum. So those are all of the FIDO2 enums with type converters to and from strings. And as I say, that will allow us to expose those fields in the GraphQL schema as strings, whereas in our API, they can be typed as the appropriate enum. And this type converter here will enable GraphQL to do that conversion for us when it's handling the requests and responses. So we don't need to handle that type conversion logic within our code for either the queries or mutations. So now that we've added those type converters, we're going to want to add our mutation type. So what we're going to do is right-click on the API project, add a new class, and I'm going to call this class Mutation, like so. Next up, back in the program.c#, I'm going to add the mutation conventions and the mutation type. So what I'm going to do, just beneath our call to add GraphQL server, I'm going to say add mutation conventions and then add mutation type of type mutation, like so. And this will automatically wire up that mutation class into the GraphQL server. Now we're going to want to add a mutation to create public key credential creation options. Before we do that, however, we're going to want to right-click the API project. We're going to add a new directory, and we're going to call this directory exceptions. And within here, we're going to create a new user not found exception. So I'm going to create a class called user not found exception, like so. And this class is going to extend the exception type. And within here, I'm going to set the message to failed to find the user, like so. Again, feel free to use an alternative method, alternative exception message, depending on your application's conventions or requirements. And this user not found exception will be thrown by the mutation that we're about to create if we're unable to find a corresponding user. So what we are going to do within our mutation class, we're going to create a method to create public key credential creation options. So what we're going to do is we're going to say public async task of type JSON element, like so. We're going to call this create public key credential creation options async, like so. And then we're going to pass in a handful of parameters or arguments into this method. The first one is going to be our distributed cache that we added to our startup services. We're then also going to pass in our application DB context. And we're also going to pass in the FIDO2 service. These three services are the various services that we're going to use within the logic of this method. And we're now going to specify the inputs for this mutation. So the first input is going to be string user ID. And we're going to use the GraphQL type attribute to specify that this is going to be a non-null ID. In order to do that, we can specify GraphQL type, type of non-null type of type ID type. Next up, after user ID, we're going to add a parameter for the authenticator attachment. So for that, we can say authenticator attachment. This is going to be nullable, and then we can simply say authenticator attachment like so. And much like we did for the user ID, we're going to specify that this is going to be GraphQL type, and this is going to be a type of string type, like so. And you'll recall back in the program.c# file, we added the type converters to convert a string to the authenticator attachment enum. And that means that with this GraphQL type attribute in place, in the schema, it will be a string, but in our mutation, it will actually be received as an authenticator attachment enum. Next up, we're going to add a parameter for the resident key. So this is going to be of type resident key requirement, and I'm going to call it resident key like so, and I'm going to give it a default value of resident key requirement dot discouraged. And much like we did for the authenticator attachment, this is going to be GraphQL type, and this is going to be type of non-null type, and then type of string type, like so. And we're giving it a default value there of discouraged, so that if it's not included in the input in the GraphQL request, it will default to that discouraged value of the resident key requirement enum. Next up, we're going to want to add a parameter for the user verification requirement. So for that, we can say user verification requirement, and then user verification, like so. And this will have a default value of user verification requirement dot preferred. And what we can do is we can say GraphQL type, type of, and once again, this is going to be a non-null type of type string type, like so, to indicate that if the user provides it, then it must not be null. However, if they don't provide it, then it will fall back to that default preferred value of the user verification requirement enum. Now those are all of the inputs for this mutation, and last but not least, we're going to specify that we can have a cancellation token of default like so. Now, what we are going to do is we're going to start work on actually implementing the logic to create the public key credential creation options. So the first thing that we are going to do is we're going to say var user equals await. Then we'll say context dot users, like so. And then we're going to say dot include. And then we'll say user dot public key credentials, like so. And then we're going to say single or default async, where the user ID is equal to the user ID that we get passed in as an input to the mutation. And then we can also pass the cancellation token to that method like so. Next up, we're going to do a check to see if the user is null. And if the user is null, then we're going to throw a new instance of the user not found exception that we previously created within the exceptions directory. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add a couple of attributes to our method. And the first one is going to be the error attribute. And we're going to say this is going to be type of user not found exception. And that will automatically map the user not found exception to a GraphQL error within the schema. And what we're also going to do while we're here is we're going to specify the return type of this mutation. And that's going to be a non-null type of type JSON type in order to signify that this mutation is going to return a JSON scalar as the result of the mutation. Next up then, after we've checked to see if the user is null, we can say var FIDO2-User equals new FIDO2-User, like so. The name of the FIDO2 user will just be user.username. We're then going to set the ID to be the UTF-8 encoded user identifier. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say encoding.utf8.getBytes, and then we're going to say user.id in order to convert the string identifier of the user to a byte array of UTF-8 encoded bytes. And then last but not least, we're going to set the display name to be the username of the user, like so. So what we've got there is we've got the name, ID, and a property being set of the FIDO2 user. For the purposes of this sample, I'm just using the username as the display name, but feel free to adjust that display name if you have other more suitable fields or properties that you store for a user. For example, you might store their given name and family name, and you may wish to use that as the display name. Next up, we're going to get a list of existing credentials for the user in order to set as the exclude credentials argument later on. So what we're going to do is we're going to say var exclude credentials, and this is going to be user.public key credentials, and we're going to select a public key credential descriptor using the public key credential. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say new public key credential descriptor, and then we're going to say credential.id, like so, and then we're going to convert that to a list. And this list is the list of existing public key credentials for that user, and those are passed to the UI as excluded credentials because the user may have already created public key credentials. We don't want to allow the user to create duplicate public key credentials. So this exclude list is a list of already created credentials, and we use that to specify that we don't want the user to be able to create duplicate credentials that we already have stored for them in the database. So next up, we are going to create our authenticator selection. So what we're going to do is we're going to say var authenticator selection equals new authenticator selection. And then within here, we're going to say authenticator attachment, and this is going to equal the authenticator attachment input parameter for the mutation. We're then going to set the resident key to equal resident key, and then user verification will equal user verification, like so. And because we set up those type converters to convert from a string to the enum, it means that we don't have to do that conversion logic here within the body of the mutation method. That's automatically handled by the type converter that we set up in the program.c# file where we added in our GraphQL server. What we're then going to do is we're going to say var extensions, and we're going to say this equals new authenticator extensions client inputs, like so. And within here, we're going to specify extensions equals true. We're going to specify user verification method equals true. We're set device pub key to equal new authentication extensions device public key inputs, like so. And then we can specify cred props also to equal true. And those are the extensions that we are going to use when we request a credential in the browser slightly later on. Next up, with all of those arguments defined, we can now request a new credential creation options from the FIDO2 service. So what we can do is we can say var options equals FIDO2.request new credential. And then in here, we can specify our FIDO2 user as the first argument. We can then specify exclude credentials. Next up, we can specify the authenticator selection. We can then specify that we want the attestation conveyance preference to be none. And then, last but not least, we can pass in our extensions like so. Now what we're going to want to do is we're then going to want to set these options in our distributed cache so that we can then retrieve them when we actually come to add the public key credential later on. That's because this is a two-step process. First of all, we create the public key credential creation options. We then store those in our cache. The browser will then prompt the user to create a public key credential. That public key credential will then be sent into a second mutation, which will actually add the credential into our database. And it's during that second step that we then need to retrieve these options from the cache. So what we are going to do is we're going to say await cache.setString async, like so. And then I'm going to specify the cache key as users, and then user ID, like so. And then I'm going to specify FIDO2 attestation options as the key for the entry in the cache. Next up, I'll specify options.toJSON, like so. I'm then going to specify new distributed cache entry options. And within these options, I will set the absolute expiration relative to now to simply be time span from minutes, and I'll specify that as 5 minutes to indicate that the cache entry will be valid for 5 minutes before becoming stale. So that will give the user 5 minutes, which should be plenty of time to create their public key credential and then get that second mutation executed within the API. But again, feel free to adjust that duration depending on your particular application's requirements. Last but not least, I can then pass in the cancellation token into that setString async method. And now, last but not least, we can specify that we're going to return JSON serializer.serialize2element. We're going to then pass in the options like so, and then we're going to say FIDO model serializer context .default .credential create options like so. And this will serialize that options instance to a JSON element, and it's the JSON element that we return from the mutation as the JSON scalar in the GraphQL schema. So this GraphQL type attribute specifies that the JSON element will be converted to the JSON scalar within the GraphQL schema. So this mutation here is going to create our public key credential creation options. And what we're now going to do is create the second follow-up mutation, which will actually add a public key credential into our database. So what we are going to do is, first of all, we're going to add a type for our authenticator attestation response input. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on the types directory. I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call this authenticator attestation response input type. And this is going to extend input object type, and this is going to be of type authenticator attestation raw response dot attestation response, like so. We're going to override the configure method like so, and we're going to say descriptor dot bind fields explicitly, and then we're going to say descriptor dot name, and the name for this type is going to be authenticator attestation response input, like so. And now we're going to set up bindings for the 3 fields that exist in this type. So for that, we're going to say descriptor.field, and we're going to specify response.attestation object as the first field. This is going to have the name attestation object, like so. And the type of this field is going to be a non-null type of type string type, like so. Next up, we're going to do the same thing again, but this time we're going to do this for the client data JSON field. And this is going to have the name client data JSON, like so. And once again, the type for this is going to be non-null type of string type, like so. Third and finally, we're going to bind the transports field. So for that, we're going to specify response.transports, like so. The name of this is simply going to be transports, and the type of this is going to be non-null type of type list type of type, again, non-null type of type string type, like so. And that's going to specify that the type of transports is essentially a non-null list, and the list will contain type non-null strings. So that will essentially be a list of strings with neither the list nor the strings within it being able to be null. So those are the three fields for our Authenticator attestation response input. We have the attestation object, client data JSON, and transports. And it's important that these names here align with what we're going to be specifying as the inputs later on. So it's important that you take note of these names, and I'll show you where we reference these later on. Just in case you do choose to use a different name, you'll need to slightly update the code later on based on whatever you've named these input fields. So next up, we're going to want to add a couple of exceptions. So the first exception we're going to add is just a simple FIDO2 exception, like so. The FIDO2 exception is going to have a nullable string message passed into it, and this is going to extend the exception type, passing in that message argument into the base constructor. Next up, we're going to want to create an exception for when the public key credential creation options could not be found. So we're going to add a new class within that exceptions folder. We're going to call it public key credential creation options not found exception. And what we're going to do here is we're going to extend the exception class like so. And then here in the message to exception, we're going to say failed to find the public key credential creation options, like so. And now that we have these two exceptions created, we're going to start working on the public key credential mutation to add a public key credential to our database. So what we can do, back in the mutation class, we're going to create a new method at the top of this class, and it's going to be a public async. It's going to return a task of type public key credential, and we're going to call this add public key credential async, like so. We're going to specify a couple of attributes on this method. We're going to first of all want to add two error attributes, one for the FIDO2 exception and one for the public key credential creation options not found exception. We're also going to specify the GraphQL type that this mutation is going to return, and that's going to be a type of non-null type, and then it's going to be our public key credential type from our types directory that we have created previously. So that's going to indicate that the mutation is going to return a non-null public key credential as the type in the GraphQL schema. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add the parameters for our add public key credential async mutation. First of all, we're going to want to have the distributed cache injected into the mutation. We're going to do the same thing with the application DB context. And then we're also going to do the same thing with the FIDO2 service. Next up, we're going to define the inputs for this mutation. First of all, we're going to specify a byte array called ID, and this is going to be GraphQL type. This will be type of non-null type, and that will be type of ID type, like so. And you'll recall previously we set up type converters in the GraphQL server to automatically convert from a byte array to a string and vice versa, which is what allows us to type the byte array as the ID scalar in the GraphQL schema. Next up, we're going to specify another byte array, and this one is going to be called raw ID. And for this, we're going to use the GraphQL type attribute, and this is going to be set to non-null type of string type. Once again, taking advantage of that type conversion from a string to a byte array and vice versa. We're then going to specify the public key credential type. And for that, we're going to use the public key credential type from the FIDO2-Netlib. So for that, we're going to say FIDO2-Netlib dot objects dot public key credential type. We're going to call that input field type, and then we're going to use the GraphQL type attribute to specify that this is going to be type of non-null type of type string type, like so. We're then going to specify an input for the client extension results. And this is going to be a JSON element. It's going to be called client extension results, like so. And then we're going to specify this will be GraphQL type. And this is going to be type of non-null type of type JSON type. And that will mean in the GraphQL schema, this will appear as a JSON scalar, and that will automatically be converted to a JSON element when the mutation executes in the API. Next up, what we're going to do is we're going to create an input for the attestation response. So for that, we're going to say authenticator attestation raw response dot attestation response. This parameter will be called response, and we're going to specify the GraphQL type for this will be type of. Once again, we use the non-null type, and this will be the authenticator attestation response input type that we created in our types directory just a few moments ago. Last but not least, we're also going to specify the user ID, and we're going to map that to a non-null type of type ID type to indicate that the user ID will appear in the GraphQL schema as an ID scalar. Last but not least, we can pass a cancellation token with a default fallback in case one is not available. So those are the different parameters that are going to be provided to this mutation. And now we're going to actually start implementing the body of the mutation method. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, we're going to first of all say var JSON equals await, and then we're going to say cache dot get string async, and then we're going to specify users, and then we're going to pass in the user ID, and then we're going to say FIDO2 attestation options, like so. And we can also pass in our cancellation token, like so. Next up, we're going to say if string dot is null or empty, passing in a JSON, then we're going to throw a new public key credential creation options not found exception to indicate that we've been unable to find the previously cached public key credential creation options, and that the caller to this mutation should call that other mutation first to create the options before then calling this mutation second. What we're going to do, once we have checked to see if the JSON is not either null or empty, is we're going to new up the authenticator attestation raw response. So for that, we're going to say var attestation response equals new authenticator attestation raw response, like so. And here we're going to specify the ID. We're going to specify the raw ID, like so. We're also going to pass in the type. We'll pass in the response, and we will also specify the client extension results. And to do that, we're going to say client extension results dot deserialize, and then we're going to use the FIDO model serializer context dot default dot authentication extensions client outputs, like so. And that will create an authenticator attestation raw response instance based on the inputs that were provided to our mutation. So now that we have the attestation response, we can say var options equals credential create options dot from JSON, and we can provide the JSON string that we retrieved from the cache earlier on in this mutations method body. Next up, we're going to want to actually make our FIDO2 public key credential using the FIDO2 service. So what we're going to do is we're going to say var result equals await FIDO2 dot make new credential async, and we're going to pass in the attestation response. We're also going to pass in the options. We're then going to create a function that will check to see if the public key credential is unique. So what we're going to do is we're going to specify async as this will be an asynchronous function. The parameters passed to the function will be params and then cancellation token, like so. And we're then going to say not await context dot public key credentials dot any async, and then we're going to say where the credential dot ID is equal to the params dot credential ID. We're also going to then pass the cancellation token to that call to any async. And then, last but not least, we can pass the cancellation token to the make new credential async method call. And what that is credential ID unique to user callback function is going to do is it's going to query the database to check to see if there are any existing credentials with the credential ID. And if there are, then it's going to return false, indicating that the credential ID already exists and is not unique or not a new credential for that user. And that will enable us to check to ensure that we don't create any duplicate credentials for a user. So now that we have that result, we're going to do a check to see if it is successful. So what we can do is we can say if result dot result is null, then we're going to infer that the make new credential was unsuccessful. And so we're going to throw a new FIDO2 exception, and we're going to pass in the error message like so. However, if the result is not null, in other words, we're implying that it was successful, then we can create a new instance of our public key credential entity ready to be stored in the database. So what we can do is we can say var credential equals new public key credential, like so. And within here, we can specify the ID as a result.result.id. We can specify the public key as result.result.public key, like so. We're then going to do the same thing with the signature counter using the sign count property on the result. We'll then specify whether backup is illegible using the is backup illegible property on the result. We'll also specify whether or not the credential is backed up using the same named property on the result that we get back. We're then going to specify the attestation object, and this will use a result.result.attestation object, like so. We're going to do the same thing for the client data JSON, which will also use the same named property on the result. We will then initialize the attestation format, again using the same result.result syntax that we have been using with the attestation format property from the result. Next up, the AA GUID. We will do the same thing with result.result.AA GUID, like so. And then last but not least, we will use the user ID that's provided as an input to set the user ID for the public key credential. Next up, we are going to say for each, and then we're going to iterate over the result.result.transports. And then we'll say var authenticator transport. And then what we'll do here is we'll say credential.authenticator transports.add. And then we're going to create a new instance of authenticator transport. And we'll set the public key credential ID to be result.result.id. And the value of the authenticator transport will be the actual authenticator transport itself. Next up, we can do a check to see if result.result.device public key is not null. And in that case, we can say credential.devicePublicKeys.add. We can new up an instance of the device public key entity. And we can say public key credential ID equals result.result.id. And then the value is going to equal result.result.devicePublicKey, like so. Next up, what we're going to do is we're going to say await context dot public key credentials dot add async. We'll pass in the credential, and then we'll also pass in the cancellation token, like so. We're then going to call await context dot save changes async, once again passing in that cancellation token. And then we can simply return the credential from the mutation as the result being returned back to the consumer. And using the GraphQL type attribute at the top of the mutation, it will automatically map the public key credential to the public key credential type in the GraphQL schema. So those there are our two mutations, one to add public key credential, and then one to create the public key credential creation options. Now what we're going to do is we're going to test those two mutations. And in order to do that, I have gone on ahead and inside the www.root directory of the API, I've created an index.html file. Within this index.html file, I've created a simple form with a user ID input, and I've then created a simple script that will take the user ID from the form input. It will then send a mutation to create public key credential creation options, passing in the user ID as the input. It will then take the JSON from the response that we get back from the GraphQL mutation. It will check to see if it's null or undefined, in which case it will throw an error. Otherwise, it will coerce the response that we get from the server into a browser-compatible format using the coerce to array buffer helper function from the FIDO2-Net library. It will then prompt the user to create a credential using the navigator.credentials.create function, passing in that JSON as the public key credential creation options. If that is successful, we will then have a credential returned to us from that function, and we then coerce that credential to backend format using the coerce to base64 URL helper function from the FIDO2.Net library, and we'll use the add public key credential mutation, passing that credential and the user ID as the inputs to that mutation. And we then specify that we have the public key credential returned as the response for that mutation. We then deserialize that response JSON to the public key credential, and then we do a simple check to see if it's null or undefined, throwing an error if it is, indicating that it failed to add the public key credential. As I mentioned, we have those helper functions, coerce to array buffer and coerce to base64 URL down here at the bottom, and these are taken directly from the FIDO2.Net library GitHub if you want to look at those for reference. So as I say, this is just a very simple HTML page with a form to allow us to test those couple of mutations by actually creating a FIDO2 public key credential. So what we're going to do is we're going to build and run the API. So what we can do there is we can hit the run button up there to build and run the API. We can see it's running on localhost port 7054. If we go here to our browser, to that same port, /GraphQL, give that a refresh, and we can see that we have our Nitro user interface provided by Hot Chocolate. And if we browse the schema, we have our previously created public key credentials query. And we also have our two mutations. We have add public key credential and create public key credential creation options. If we take a look at this one first, we can see here that we have the authenticator attachment, resident key, user ID, and user verification. And you'll notice how the resident key and the user verification have automatically been converted from the enum to a string using the type converters that we set up in the startup where we called the add GraphQL server. And we can see these default to discouraged and preferred for the resident key and user verification respectively. If we go back to the payload of that mutation, you can see that we have our errors array, just in case one or more errors are thrown within the body of the mutation. And then we also have our JSON that gets returned, and that JSON is the actual public key credential creation options that we then use to prompt the user to create a credential in that index.html JavaScript. Next up, we have our add public key credential mutation. The input takes the client extension results, which is a JSON scalar. We have the credential ID, which is an ID scalar. We have the raw ID, which is a string, and the string will be converted to a byte array using the associated type converter that we registered in our program startup. We then have our response, we have the type, and we have the user ID. And if we drill down into the response, you can see here that we have the attestation object, we have the client data JSON, and we have the transports. And if we go back to that index.html file, you'll recall that we have properties in this response object here for attestation object, client data JSON, and transports. If you named these fields something different in the GraphQL schema, then you'll need to make sure that the fields or properties here in the response object within the mutation input align with whatever you've named those fields in the GraphQL schema. If we go back to the browser, we can then take a look at the payload that we get back from that mutation. And we can see there that we have our array of errors, just in case one or more errors occur. And then we also have our public key credential. And the public key credential type is one that we defined previously. And for the purposes of this sample, that just binds the ID field or ID property as the ID scalar. But you may have additional fields in here if you have chosen to bind additional fields in that public key credential type within the GraphQL API. So what I am going to do now is test those couple of mutations using that index.html file that we created for the purposes of testing. So over here, I've gone to that same port /index.html, and I can see here that we have that index.html file being rendered in the browser. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the database like so, and I'm going to go into the ASP.NET users table, and I am going to copy the user ID for my previously created user. And I'm also going to remove any previously created public key credentials to ensure that we are not creating any duplicates that we may have previously added to the database. So what we can do is we can go back into the browser. Within the user ID input here, I can paste in the ID for that particular user, just clear the network there. And if I hit submit, like so, I can see that we sent a request to create the public key credential creation options. I can see the JSON payload that I get back from the API, and we can double check the input there, seeing that we passed the user ID in as the input to the mutation, again with the response back in the payload for that mutation. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to select to use my mobile device in order to create that public key credential. I'm going to hit continue, and I can see a notification was sent to my mobile device. I can then confirm that with the mobile device like so. And now we can see this second request here. If we take a look at the input for the add public key credential mutation, we can see that we have the client extension results. We have the ID of the credential and the raw ID of said credential. We then have within the response our attestation object, our client data JSON, and our array of transports. We have the type set to public key, and we also have the user ID that we entered into the input. If we then take a look at the preview, we can see here that we have added a public key credential, and within the payload for that mutation, we have our public key credential, and we have the identifier for that public key credential. This here is the base64 URL encoded string. And if we take a look inside the database, you'll notice that we have that FIDO2 public key credential, and this here is the GUID that corresponds to that base64 URL encoded string. So if we were to decode that string, then using base64 URL decoding, that would equate to this GUID that we can see here stored in the database. So what I've shown you in this guide is how you can add in a mutation in the GraphQL API to create the public key credential creation options. We've then stored those options in a distributed cache so that we can then retrieve them from our add public key credential mutation. And in the add public key credential mutation, we take a created public key credential from the browser. We then also retrieve the options for the corresponding user from the cache, and we combine the credential from the browser, the options from the cache, in order to create a public key credential and then store it in the database. We then return that stored public key credential to the consumer of the API as the payload for the mutation, and that is then returned as the result of the mutation in the response, and we saw that using the ID field in the public key credential that is returned in the payload for the add public key credential mutation. So I hope you found this video useful. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.